Welcome to Security Insights. I am your host, Gunnar Peterson. I work at Auth0, which is a trust platform for digital commerce. I thought it would be a good idea to get some other voices in the security and identity space in for a chat once in a while. It's always nice to have a mind share together and hear what other problems people are tackling, how they're doing it. And without further ado, very excited for today's guest, Vittorio Bertocci. Vittorio is a principal architect at Auth0. He's the host of the Identity Unlocked podcast. Before Auth0, Vittorio had a lengthy career at Microsoft, where he worked with Fortune 100 and Global 100 companies, including working on Microsoft's Azure Active Directory team as principal program manager, focusing on the developer experience, which one of the topics I want to get to today. Vittorio has also written several books on identity. I vividly recall reading Understanding Windows Card Space on a long airplane trip on a Kindle, and it was one of the most virtual feelings I've ever had in my life, of going across the clouds, reading about virtual identity on a little device. It was amazing. So that, thank you for that. I know you've written several other books as well. And Vittorio contributed to the inception of one of the most interesting fundamental shifts in access control today at Microsoft, which was the claims-based access control platform, which comes under sails under various flags: the Windows Identity Foundation, ADFS, and a whole list of other types of identity middleware. So if you're in the identity middleware business, you certainly know Vittorio. If you use computers, you're using his work. He's a well-known speaker and educator. When I told one of our teammates here that I was having you as a podcast guest, she is ex-Microsoft, and she said, oh, he was the best trainer we ever had at Microsoft. I always get excited when Vittorio is a teacher. So without further ado, great to have you here today, Vittorio.
Thank you. You managed to get some color on my face, which these days is not very colorful. So thank you.
Well, we go back a little ways. I think it's fair to say to sort of the earlier days in identity, when the game was really about, I think it's fair to say, adoption and trying to, in your case, build those interesting technologies into Windows products and other products on the web, but also to get customers to deploy them and maximize them in real life. And it feels like in the early days when you and I first met at places like Identiverse and Cloud Identity Summit and places like that, it was chasing after adoption. It was saying, SAML is coming, OAuth is coming, OpenID Connect is coming, all of these things are coming. Here's the value proposition. I don't know if we're done yet on all of those things, but we're significantly farther than we were. And it feels to me a little bit like we're the dog that caught the car. We're the dog that was, 10 years ago was chasing the car up and down our street, barking at it. Now we've caught the car, and it's like, what do we do with it? And I think the questions I wanted to get to today is, what does that mean that we have achieved reasonably good adoption? What does it mean to developers? What does it mean to users? And in my little world of information security, what do you think it means in terms of information security and protecting systems? So those are the things I wanted to get to today. I think your perspectives on all of these is going to be absolutely fascinating. Starting with the first one, though, where do you see the starting point that we have today with really impressive building blocks like OpenID Connect and OAuth? What does that mean to a developer experience? Do you feel like developers, do they need to be identity experts? Do they need to understand identity the same way somebody at Identiverse would, or are these at the point where it's like point, click, and go? Or I remember in the early days of WS security, one of the goals was a checkbox for web services security. I don't think we're at a checkbox. I don't know if we want developers to be complete protocol experts, but where are we in between those two things?
So much stuff on this plate. It's overflowing. First, I absolutely love your analogy of like the dog that chases the car and says, and now what? And in so many things, we still have a long way to go. But for others, we actually did get where we wanted to get. And to answer your question, I have to zoom out a bit and then I'll zoom back in. And I think that what happened when you and I started in the space was that if you were very close to the matter, it was pretty clear that identity was one of the capabilities, like this was the service-oriented days, one of the fundamental capabilities that deserved to be factored out of the various places where it was being implemented, like applications and similar, or even better, like network level, the operating system, and operated as its own capability that could be reused across the board. And this wasn't an easy thing to sell to people because people were used to identity just coming from the air around them, especially developers. And like whenever they needed identity, they just reached out and Kerberos already did everything for them. And so they weren't even aware of this. And it was a good thing because like unless there is some optionality, something that is actionable, developers shouldn't be burdened with details, which is a forward answer to the question, but we're not there yet. But then this magical thing happened. The cloud, people started, before the need for extracting identity was engineering agility. So SharePoint didn't want to deal with identity because it's complicated and said, well, you guys, Active Directory, already do this. Why don't you do identity for me? And then there were like this extranet, a word that I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard in a long time, which were like company one, company two, one is a supplier, one is like a warehouse manager. They need to be really close to each other. And so somehow they need to bridge this gap of untrusted network between them without doing unholy stuff like shadow accounts and stuff like that. So those were interesting scenarios, but they weren't industry-changing scenarios. But the cloud was the moment in which people started taking their own stuff and deploy it in places that can be reached only through untrusted networks. And the moment in which software, so much software, started being available as a service, as opposed to something that you can place in your perimeter, suddenly people had to pay attention. They had no other choice but find a way of breaching this gap. From like a good engineering practice, it became either you find a solution for this or you don't get the job done. And I think that's what made the identity standards so widely successful. Like SAML for crossing, like for doing a cross-domain single sign-on was like a big hit, which doesn't mean it didn't require work. It required a lot of work from a lot of people, but the business case was very strong. The need for solving these problems in which you cross those boundaries in a way which is vendor independent was very important. And so that gave, I'd say, an infinite amount of fuel in all the activities which led to basically standardizing on a handful of protocols. Some of them were designed, like some of them were pretty organic, like Auth grew out of organic grassroots needs of people having multiple resources scattered across multiple owners, multiple like service providers, and the desire to integrate those in as people had their life online more and more sophisticated. And then this thing following the opposite route and coming back to the enterprise and business scenarios, and then organic abuses of Auth for using Auth for sign-in turned into official things like OpenID Connect. And today, I have to say that we are finally at the point in which those standards are ubiquitously used across the board. Of course, you have pockets and that things are not problem-free. Like I'm sure you heard about controversies about the use of the JOT format, but the fact is we have like the largest SaaS providers on the planet, the largest identity providers on the planet. They all support SAML. Most of them support OpenID. And at this point, Now I'm finally able to answer your original question. At this point, in theory, a developer which is not trying to do something special that diverges significantly from the canonical scenarios out there shouldn't have to be an expert in identity. Let's say that we have SDKs, we had them for years, that can orchestrate the dance of those protocols without the developer knowing the details of that. And then we have services which support those flows, and so both primary services, as in raw credentials, identity providers, your directories, and intermediary services, which put themselves in the middle and help you with details, as in, do you want to add MFA? Do you want to manage consent? Do you want to add an authorization layer? Do you want to accept more than one identity provider? All of those things are standardized. And allegedly, the people that make choices should know enough of this space to make architectural choices, as in, should I model this application as a confidential client or as a public client if I'm using Auth? But the thing is, a lot of those associations are actually done automatically. Like here I have this little prop. This is like a little dice game in which I have one die that represents the application type, like desktop application, long-running process on the service, and the other die has on the faces the Auth flows. You just program, and there is a simple table that tells you whether the combination you have is the correct one. So in theory, those decisions are already taken by the SDK that you pick up. The thing that makes this more difficult is that we are partly responsible, like the identity people like to talk at the protocol level. And so developers, when they find in literature things, they find it at that granularity. And so that leads them to reason at that level, even if that wouldn't be necessary. And the other is, I think that our big missed opportunity today is that we don't have very solid profiles that say, okay, OpenID Connect have at least 4 different ways of signing you in using like 4 different grants. Let's just say that for web apps that run on redirect driven by server-side stuff, we pick grant 1 and we all use it. And then at that point, you don't need to worry about, okay, is this provider supporting this or supporting that? Is this grant requiring me only the client ID, or do I need also to provision a secret? If we have profiles at this level, then we could sync down this thing truly so that the developer does the checkbox. Those checkboxes exist across the industry, but they typically work only within subsets. Like if I am in the Microsoft subset, which I know will use a certain default, then I can actually use a checkbox. But as soon as you go outside of that, then there is some confusion. And there are a number of efforts in the industry to try to bring these under control. Like, for example, FastFed is a working group under OpenID, which tries to create a profile to streamline the creation of a federation between 2 entities. And so it's making good progress, but we are not there yet. So I think that, again, my short answer finally is developers, unless they are meta identity developers, like people developing SDKs for identity or services for identity, if they are using identity, they shouldn't have to be experts in the protocol. They might benefit from knowledge of some terminology so that they can make informed choices, but ultimately the best practices should all be enshrined in SDKs, libraries, and services. We are halfway there. There are lots of really good SDKs which are open source in every platform you can think of, but we are not fully there yet because we lack profiling, and also because, of course, the grind never stops. And so now that we established those protocols, there are new scenarios and new protocols that are clamoring to come up, and so they are also getting some of the calories that instead of spending it in doing profiles, we are spending them in exploring those innovations. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Well, I appreciate the perspectives, and I think one of the things that the blurring of responsibilities that you talked about at the beginning of your answer it makes me think in some ways that identity is almost like the original DevOps problem, where you're knowing enough about development, but you're also a system operator. You're also enshrining policy by choosing these protocols. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head with the profile issue. We have maybe necessary profiles, but not sufficient profiles is one way to think about it. And giving developers in some cases enough latitude that they can do some interesting things, but they could also paint themselves into a corner rather quickly if they are picking the wrong one. It seems like there's still work to do, and I'm curious if you think and it's probably a mix of all of these three, but the opportunities at the protocol level versus at the, let's call it the first mile client level versus the last mile level, like where do you see the most interesting, I guess, problems and opportunities for developers in the near term?
One thing that you said made me remember that there is a very important distinction that I believe we need to caveat everything with, which is although the tools and the low-level protocols we use are the same, there is a very significant difference between the workforce scenarios and the customer-facing scenarios. Because in the workforce scenario, we have a lot of formulaic interactions. Like we have things that traditionally we do. Employees coming on board, employees being provisioned for their email, employees accessing a system of documents with different privileges. All of those things are pretty fixed somewhat. And the people that attended to it, the original DevOps, as you call them out, are more on the ops than on the dev. Let's say that they expect to have a booklet that says exactly how things will work. Their goal is risk management and containment rather
operational efficiency,
rather than how to say expressive power. Whereas if you go on the customer facing things, then things suddenly are different. Let's say that the users of an airline are different from users of the hotel chain, which are even more different than users from a streaming service, which are very different from users of the ride sharing. Or like you can think of so many different ways of being yourself online, depending on the service that you're doing. And that is the part where the standardization becomes a bit more complicated. Like in theory, we can still have this base and say, okay, here's the identity layer, that's what happens, and then build your differences on top of it. But while we are still in this uncertain place, people tend to inject some of the logic intermixed with the identity layer. Sometimes because it's very convenient. Like imagine you are accessing a system and this system needs to check whether you signed an NDA or not. It's very convenient to put it in the authentication pipeline because now this check will be present no matter the flavor of the app you're using. You might have your web app, you might have your mobile app, you might have your smart TV app. And if this is in the identity pipeline, then you get this capability for free everywhere. But that also means that the layering gets more complicated. But anyway, I think that if you go on the workforce side of the house, the best opportunity you have is in the admin tools. And it's nothing new under the sun. Like the MMC consoles in Windows NT did everything for your local domain. Now you can think of way more powerful controls that allow you to manage a way more heterogeneous zoo or different animals, like the SaaS app, the local app, all of that stuff. And the place where you have the most power, the most power to help is in those admin consoles and possibly into plugins if you manage. Because given that you can't control the breadth of all the apps and how the apps are developed, then somehow you need to provide something post-fact that helps the administrator to do this. On the developer side, I think that the opportunities are definitely in the SDKs. Like people shouldn't reinvent the wheel. No one should have to write a Pixie implementation. Pixie
Yeah.
is a low-level trick for protecting authorization codes in transit. It truly is a low-level trick. And yet I hear developers saying the word Pixie all the time, which to me is akin to someone saying, oh yeah, the exponential backoff of TCP IP. The what? Like most people have no idea that there are packets that are being exchanged in TCP IP, and that when you miss one delivery, you will try again, but not all the time. You'll have this backoff thing. It's a detail which is not actionable for people. So, in theory,
on that one, I think it's always funny that people will immediately say, if you want to write your own cryptography, everybody will dive immediately in front of the bus to stop you, rightly so, from writing your own cryptography. Like, don't think that you're smarter than all of these people who've been working on this for their whole careers. Just stop and use the public, the available AES or what have you. However, in the case of identity, every single day somebody wakes up and goes into work and says, I'm going to write my own identity layer. And I never understand why they think they can get all of those decisions right. You could even make the case that with the protocol flows, in terms of how pervasive identity is, it might actually be harder.
Well, the thing is, you get such a heterogeneous take. Like, I will not name names, but I recently had lunch. It was at the Identityverse in Denver. I had lunch with this veteran of identity, like a really important figure who's a friend and who's like incredibly competent in this area. And we got to the argument of SDKs, and he was saying, well, when you use OpenID, OpenID Connect, you don't need SDKs. And basically, he was making the point that when you do a flow from a confidential client and you get an ID token directly by hitting the token endpoint, which is like a direct line, you don't need to check signatures. And so all the checks that you are doing on the token are easy. And so you don't need an SDK. You can just do it yourself, which is, in my opinion, extremely dangerous, because it's true that the checks are not, crazy checks, but they are always the same. They can be there are countless opportunities to get this wrong. So to me, telling people, sure, go read the spec and then just go from spec to code without using any intermediate library, to me is just not the right way to go for this.
It's like saying, chess is an easy game. You just move your pieces down the board and you take the other person's king. Yes, it's very easy if you describe it that way. But and if you're the person in Denver who you're speaking of, you probably can figure out what 17 moves you need to make in what order, and how do you do when the board's moving against you. But somehow it is pretty hard to win chess games against good players, even though the end is quite simple to understand.
You are once again, I absolutely love your metaphor. And I think that here there is a bit of a curse of knowledge that you're hinting at. Like, we live immersed in this all the time, which is why I love to go not only to Identiverse, but also to conferences like the Gartner IIM, in which you go and you talk to technology managers that have a vested interest in making the right move and making the right choices, but they simply don't have an appreciation of these low-level details. And so that forces you to up-level your thinking and saying, okay, those things are details, and I cannot expect the people that will make decisions in this context to have that kind of discernment. Even the people that they were used to, now they are busy. They are doing lots of other things. So you can't ask people to operate at that level. So for sure, I think that the people that come from SAML, from WS Trust, for which this stuff was insanely complicated. If you look at OpenID, any developer that understands HTTP understands this thing. But again, I'm gonna steal your analogy of the rules of chess are easy. Being playing chess professionally isn't. So I don't think that we should ask everyone to become experts, because there is no point. So there is the library part. The other part where I am a very strong believer is in tooling. Let's say that typically developers, when they build their solutions and their applications, have their tool set. They use already stuff. Like, for example, if you are on React has a lot of command line integrations in which you can use a templating engine and basically say what is the shape of the app that you want, and this will generate stuff out. Or like Eclipse, Visual Studio Code, all these environments give accelerators for the developers. So those environments and web portals, all of these ensemble, already today, different vendors try to help the developer through this big decision tree in which you land on this thing, you say, okay, you want to do an app, which flavor of app are you doing? Is it a web app, or is it a mobile app, or is it a command line app? And as you click through this thing, we do this branching and we do our best to configure things so that you don't need to be worried about low-level stuff. Unfortunately, there are situations in which it's just very hard for us to make decisions on your behalf. Like, for example, if you are building a single-page app, it's a special case of web app in which JavaScript plays an important role. But are you only calling your backend? So you have JavaScript on your page and the APIs are only in the same domain from where you got HTML? Or do you need to call stuff that is also elsewhere? Like, do you need to call APIs from others? And if you do you have a component on the backend to which you can delegate some of this functionality? Like, for example, acquiring tokens so that this very critical logic of token acquisition can be done on the service, which is more secure than a browser where anything goes. Or you need to do everything browser side. Or can you do both acquiring the token and proxying calling the APIs from the backend, which is not always the case, because if you are in multiple geographies, you might not be able to do that. So all of those complications make a big difference in the kind of flow that you will use. But there is no very easy way of asking the developer what they want to do. They might not know it themselves. So this is one of those areas where it gets harder. But before that, like if you're doing a choice between a mobile app or a web app, the choice between of what you use from a mobile app is very clear. And for most of the platforms, there are already SDKs that expose primitives at the app level, not at the protocol level. Like you might have an API that says sign in, and this API that says sign in actually calls a system browser and hits the authorization endpoint that it found by metadata. So you as the developer just have to configure this SDK by saying, this is the URL of the service from where I'm getting authentication. That's it. You don't need to worry more about it. So it's a trench war. Like whenever we have a tactical opportunity to help, we do it. It would be good if we'd be more consistent across the board. But ultimately, developers, like some developers actually refuse the black box and say, I want to know what's there, which to me, that's where open source come into play. Like you can have a SDK that exposes a very high level API sign in or get access token. And if I want to know what's going on, I should be able to just get the source, maybe even the symbol, so the debugger can help me. And I should be able to see all the internal calls, which should be layered so that as I move to the next level in the stack, I should see protocol APIs so that if I'm curious, I can go in the code and understand. But if I'm not curious, I should not be blocked because I haven't looked inside this thing. So once again, super long answer. I think that for developers, it's a mix of runtime SDKs, both for acquiring and caching tokens and for validating tokens, depending on the part of the architecture that you're working on, and really good management tools for creating and configuring applications.
And I like that. Both of those answers are one of the reasons why I was excited to have you as a guest, because I almost visualize a Venn diagram in your brain as you're going through. One of the strengths I see in your work is going through all of the different perspectives And switching from the developer perspective, which I think is still super important to where we need to get to next, but looking at it from a a user perspective, and I think probably not the workforce user as much for this particular question, but when these protocols started rolling out, one of the big user value propositions was and still is single sign-on. And I think that's been achieved to I think the degree maybe we could have reasonably expected, versus some of the more larger claims that people thought would happen, which would be more portable identity, and the ability for what some people call user-centric identity and things like this. Those use cases, I don't think we've quite got there yet. What do you think the user, the non-workforce user, just an internet user, an e-commerce user, what do you think they get out of all of these identity protocols, and what could they reasonably expect to get over increased adoption of these over the next 2 to 3 years?
That part is also complicated. I'd say that the availability of those protocols truly unlocked so much of what the web can do today. Like the ability of granting delegated access across websites has been incredibly powerful. And then by extension, the fact that people that frequently used one particular app could use that app to sign in other apps created like this tightly, like very dense ecosystem in which you can reasonably expect in almost every app to have a sign in with, and it's going to be Twitter, it's going to be Apple, it's going to be Google, it's going to be Facebook, and so on and so forth. Now,
and even stepping off of the web, right? Like into the real world, the physical world, with COVID, you see a lot of you want to go to this concert, you want to go to this conference, you have to register, you have to get a clear ID, or you have to get an ID from someplace else, and that's going to be the proof that you're going to show. And so there's some other really interesting rewiring of protocols that, to me, start to get at the more portable identity. It's still sort of a claim at a time for an event here or there, but I think we're starting to see some of that. I don't know if you're seeing more portability as part of this.
Absolutely. So what's happening is that the scenarios that you described are new scenarios. Let's say that when we sign in, typically we are doing so because we want to start a session of sort, or because we are a returning user and we want to retrieve whatever context we had in there. And so all of those things typically have an element of like recognition rather than I am trying to go past a bump, like for example, here the clear ID, I am clear. And so the system for signing in has problems of its own, like the fact that social sign-in had its time, but now it's starting to contract a bit because between the fact that the service providers realized that they wanted more direct relationship with users, and instead when they outsource these to a social provider, now they are at the whims of that social provider. Like social provider might decide, well, this user did something against my policy, so I'm going to suspend their account. And now that user can no longer access all the other things that rely on that. Or like analytics, people don't like to talk about it, but when you sign in with Google, you are giving them a whole load of things about the user that instead, if you handle sign in yourself, you might be able to get. Now, the user might not be okay with either, saying, I don't want to be tracked, but here between the service provider and the potential identity provider, there is always this bit of tension, as in, I want to gather data, I want to how to retrieve this thing. And also some, in more general, the societal point of view, there is this thing about the fact that so much of a consumer identity focused on a handful of providers. This was something that we tried, I'd say, naively to prevent back in the card space days, in which we said, well, we don't want the emergence of artificially large identity providers, but then Darwinian pressure produced exactly that. But now we are at a point in which those providers know so much that people are getting scared about that. And here also I have to mention that it's not just about sign-in. So much of the privacy violations occur with things like trackers in the browser observing your behavior, whether you are signed in or not. Or you might use a very secure privacy-preserving sign-in mechanism, but then as you're using the service, you might buy something and give your address and your legal name or whatever you're doing. You might be disclosing things that make it very easy to collate your information across the board. So the traditional way of doing identity or just navigating the web has intrinsic issues, privacy issues. And then there are things that are not part of these, but that we always had in a form or another. Like the moment in which you needed to prove something that goes beyond just the ability to reclaim the same user that you signed up yesterday, but appeal to an external authority, like you needed to upload a scan of your driving license, or they needed to know it's really you, so you need to turn on the webcam and show your face together with the driving license. Those things exist and we are very inconvenient. COVID created the clear need to make them convenient, because as soon as you need to do those at scale, like big events, you have tens of thousands of people to check, you can't afford to have an inefficient system, then the evolutionary pressure to have other ways of proving your identity, and ways which are less directly tied to the provider, but something that, to use your words, is more portable. As in, I have it in my wallet, and now I choose when and how to disclose it. It's clearly a new need. I want to emphasize new need because this does not necessarily substitute the things that we are already doing. Like, we might stop to use some of those centralized, fungible authentication services, but those verifiable credentials are not necessarily the thing that we will use instead. But those new things are really, really useful for situations in which you absolutely need to be privacy preserving at the sign-in phase, or when you need to prove something from an authority out of those existing, let's call them federations. You want to be able to have flexibility to disclose those things without the identity provider knowing when and with whom you are disclosing, and with a wide range of providers. That's a great vision, and a lot of people are working on it. The thing that I'm not crazy about of this vision is twofold. One is that people are selling it very hard, and they aren't looking at complications. Like when you have your clear thing and you want to show it to people, the people that see this thing needs to know how to check the signature of whatever is being shown in there. So not just your signature as the wallet holder, but the authority. And to me, the paradigmatic example is a few months ago, I was in a bar in Bellevue with colleagues from Belgium and France. And I showed my driving license from the Washington State, and I was given my cognac. And instead, my two friends had to go back to the hotel to retrieve their passport, because their driving license, which is perfectly valid in all the EU countries, here is useless plastic. So move all of these in internet scale and think of a service that now needs to accept credentials. In the federation world, we solved this problem by exchanging metadata and all of that. Sure, we are constrained, like everything needs to be part of this thing, but in the case in which you just can present your credentials, you need to find a way of teaching to the verifiers which things are verifiable, like which things they should trust. And it's non-trivial. Again, it's one of those chess things in which the theory is, sure, I can present these credential to anyone, but in fact, today, I can issue you an access token and put there a bogus audience. Audience can be everyone. It's not like the service side needs to check it. Is that we normally check it because it's a security measure. And in this new world, we are relaxing this new security measure, but we are not really giving a lot of guidance yet on what to do instead. And you cannot afford not to do anything. Otherwise, you'll have people with wallets full of stuff that can be used. Like my nightmare scenario is you have your phone with one wallet for each provider, as opposed to a wallet with multiple providers. And that credential is tightly tied, like closely tied to a specific set of resources, which would recreate what we already have today, which is already very tight, and not live up to the potential of this stuff. So I'm a bit mad at the people that talk about this because they sell it and they don't highlight the difficulties. And to me, real adoption means, yes, we believe in this vision. Those are the difficult things that you need to figure out. Let's figure them out together. If you hide the difficult things, that means that you are selling for some other reason, and I don't want to get into what those reasons might be. And the other reason for which I'm not crazy about this is that people ties the verifiable credentials to the decentralized world. And I think that decentralized world is a different set of problems and solutions, and sometimes solutions in search of a problem that are not necessarily part of this. Let's say that if I'm using a mobile driving license, that mobile driving license derives all its power from the issuing authority. I might have some mechanism for protecting my use and my wallet so that it's tied to my own key, but ultimately, the thing that the verifier wants is to believe what the authority says about me. And so, whether my key comes from a ledger or comes from somewhere else, it doesn't make much of a difference. So, to me, there are scenarios in which both decentralized and verifiable credential together make sense, but it's not a given. There are perfectly valid scenarios, I dare say the most obvious one nowadays, where I can use verifiable credentials approach. Eventually, once we'll have solved the other problems, without having to see a blockchain, not even with binoculars. So I'm a big believer in the VC view, but it's additive. It doesn't substitute what we do. It's more power for us, for more scenarios. And I think that there are a lot of things to figure out, and we should get serious about figuring this out as industry rather than selling just the idea because it's a nice bedtime story that, oh, you have control of your identity. And we should bring in decentralized only when it's really useful and not as a tax that we need to pay whenever we talk about VC.
And I think the real engineering always starts with really understanding and then embracing the constraints that you have, right? So if we're building a rocket ship to the moon, weight of cargo is going to be a massive constraint, and it doesn't do any good to say you can go to the moon and, oh, by the way, you can have a big screen TV while you're up there. If there's no way, the rocket will never get out, will never make it. So that you haven't really solved the problem. I really appreciate that perspective. Looking to the third constituent of these protocols, and there's more than three, but we only have time for three perspectives today. But this is the one I spend most of my time on, which is the cybersecurity perspective. And I think was 10 years ago now, maybe we were starting to talk about identity as the perimeter. It used to be you're inside the firewall, you're good, you're outside the firewall, you're bad. And then one day everybody woke up and said, geez, people are going across the firewall, and are they all good? Are they all bad? How do we know? Oh, we have to do all of the checks that you just talked about to verify the credentials and do the authorization mapping. So I think it's been apparent for a while now that identity is really a perimeter that the security industry, frankly, I think is still catching up to. You brought a prop, so I'm going to just grab one here. So what happens, when bugs come in, right, to the system? What happens when malicious actors deliberately try to take advantage of it? I think one reasonable security concern that we could put on the less than desired after effect of the success of rolling out identity protocols is because we have stitched together so many different systems. If or when an attacker is successful to take over an account or take over a user session, the blast radius has also increased. But in the same sense that single sign-on empowers a user, single sign-on when that account has been taken over also means that instead of I got your session to maybe one account, I got your session to an account that now spans 25 systems. And so like what threats do you see in terms of knock-on effects that maybe that have arisen out of the success of rolling out these protocols? Obviously there's a lot of pressure on the front end through bots trying to get into systems and phishing attacks trying to get into systems, and granted 99.9% of the time they're not successful, but when you can try them billions of times, 0.01% is actually just fine. If the cost of the attacker isn't much. What are the kinds of threats do you see? And I guess maybe using our sort of simple model of first mile, last mile, and protocol level, do you see any of those as particularly vulnerable or particularly pernicious, nasty attacks in those areas?
Yeah, like here I have to make a little plug. In just a couple of weeks, which is horrible because I'm not done with my deck yet, I will make a presentation at the Authenticate conference in Seattle, which is hosted by the FIDO Alliance, about attacks, and specifically attacks in the CIM space. And you're absolutely right that it's a double-edged sword, in which the more we expand accessibility and convenience for users, the more people that manage to breach defenses will have access to a variety of resources. I think that one of the biggest issues we have in here is that there is the protocols, as in the protocols that I'm used to work with, are more concerned about securely moving stuff from A to B within the boundaries of that relationship. And in themselves, they tend to consider as a separate concern things like the mechanics of authentication. Like OpenID works just as well whether you're using username, password, and security questions, and very good non-phishable security keys using roaming authenticators and WebAuthn. But OpenID specifically says
and SAML did the same. I think the last time I checked, SAML, you could generate an assertion out of like 29 different authentication types or something. So it brought to mind to me Charles de Gaulle, which said, no one should try to unify a nation that has out of the clear blue sky where they have 275 different kinds of cheese. So
yeah, those are definitely important factors, but I think that it's okay. This is just part of the layering. If you wouldn't have this kind of layering, you would end up with Corba. I don't know if you remember.
Oh yes. Yes.
For most of your listeners, which probably don't have as much white as I have in my now invisible beard, Corba was one thing that the Java community put together for doing distributed computing. And it was like the Silmarillion. It was like a huge book. And it regulated absolutely everything, down to the binary stuff in the memory, how you, today, we just can't do this. We need to have separation of concerns, and OpenID Auth do their best to protect the part that they are responsible for. But that thing is just the edge between the nodes in the graph. And so what you do in the nodes is of paramount importance. And so the fact that we still use a lot of phishable credentials is what enables some of these very large-scale attacks, which would not have been possible while the perimeter was still your building and the ability of someone to sit on front of your workstation in your local network. Now you can access stuff from remote, and you have infinite time. We have one one of the case studies that I will present at the session is a customer that had to withstand an attack for 2 months. For 2 months, they got pounded continuously for this thing. And if you'd use non-phishable credentials, those attacks would be completely pointless. But like the combination of everything is on the public network, we can do stuff at scale, and we are using phishable stuff is what enables some of those things. And then there is all the usual best practices. Like you could have everything absolutely bottomed up, and then a random developer checks in AWS key in your GitHub. And luckily, we have a growing sophistication in the tooling that will detect that you're doing this and stop you from doing it. But humans have a way of sticking the fork in the power plug, and so that still happens. I think that the main lines of defense, like starting from the resource and coming back up, are you need, at this point, you truly need something like an anomaly detector, like something that observes your requests and makes a determination on whether those are legitimate requests or they have a chance of being part of an attempt to compromise. And today, at this point, anyone who operates even at like a bit of scale on the internet needs to do this. The good news is pretty much every service out there offers these in some form or another, so it's easy to get. And you get these both from like your identity providers or from like your edge. You might be using a service for hosting your stuff, your CDN. A lot of this stuff happens behind the scenes. In transit, go ahead.
And I think it gives you a kind of like embracing constraints does when you're thinking about use cases. I think it's a chance. I've seen, a lot of the work out there now on step-up authentication standards, which to me, I think is a really refreshing step forward for the industry. It's almost like the crumple zone on the car. Instead of making something harder, there's a step up to me as a crumple zone. And we actually get safer by putting some softness in the system and embracing the uncertainty, instead of, like in your Corba example, thinking that we can ratchet down the exact right setting for every possible scenario. At some point, the right answer is, you know what? You need to talk to somebody. You need to go to a person, a chatbot, a something, and prove something through step up. I think that's a fantastic show of maturity for the industry, and I'm really glad to see that as something that anomaly detectors or behavioral monitoring or what have you can trigger that make stronger systems.
Once again, you make an absolutely excellent point. One of the fundamental differences that often security professionals have a hard time digesting, but it's unfortunately there, is that between the user acceptance levels, the tolerance you can expect from an employee that signs a contract and operates within a particular context, to access tools designed to make whatever is the thing that gets them their salary twice a month, versus a potential customer that is trying to use your service and is thrown complexity for security reasons. And if enough people decide that that complexity is enough to abandon whatever they were doing, that is an existential threat for the service provider. Like this thing is literally whether they can survive and keep making the money that allows them to do favorable quarterly report, or if they have to close shop and go home. And so the adaptive things that you hinted at, in which you try to inject a higher level of engagement for authentication only when strictly necessary, is what allows some of these services to operate. Because if you just have a blanket 2FA, maybe you wouldn't have as many users as you need to have to be profitable. And if you wouldn't do anything, eventually you get breached in a way that might mean the end of your run in business. So adaptive MFA is one of those beautiful things of modern life that can actually make some of those businesses viable. And one of the things that I like to throw here and as a complication is it's going to be an arms race. A lot of those things rely on AI, machine learning, getting a lot of signals and digesting it, finding weak features that as humans we might not find, aggregating across multiple tenants, and coming up with saying, okay, I just discovered another attack which is happening because I've seen this pattern. So let me stop all requests of this kind. But these inputs can also be used by trackers to fingerprint browsers and then start tracking users across the board. So user agents, browsers, are introducing measures that will make these more difficult, which means the trackers will have a harder time fingerprinting you. But it also means that your algorithm for deciding whether you should throw MFA or not will have a much harder time to understand what's going on and whether you should do it or not. Now, we are always evolving, and so maybe we'll switch to different signals. But the point is, this is one car that the dog will not chase. Let's say that we will have to keep running after it and be flexible enough to keep responding to the environment. And this is one of the reasons, once again, for which doing identity on your own is very hard. Because if you were to build your system, of course, you'd be blind to all of this stuff because your job is something else. Like if you are a pharmaceutical company, your calories are spent folding molecules. If you spend them tracking what's the latest in browser land in terms of what you can use for anomaly detection or not, you might not fold proteins as fast as your competitor. Also, you have no access to anyone but your own users, and the trend might originate in a different geography, in a completely different industry, and so you might just be unable to detect it. So I don't want to sound like I'm selling anything, but I think that this is one of the reasons for which some centralization has so much value, because you can rely on harnessing the wisdom of the crowds and use the lessons learned elsewhere to protect your own business instead of being the one that generates that intelligence for others, like being the bad example. But anyway, I just want to do the entire three things. For the transition, for the, like we said, last mile, the big chasm between A and B, I think that the best trick there is to stick to protocols, better stick to best practices. Like there are protocols and then there are ancillary specifications that gather all the best practices that apply to a particular protocol. Those are transition documents because eventually those practices get integrated. Practical example, Auth0 as a security best practices, and now there is Auth2.1, which is basically Auth0 plus the security best practices integrated in there. So it's a good practice whenever you go on the wire to make sure that whatever tools you're using will use the right security practices. And then on the first mile, again, it's good hygiene for devices. So from the MDM, when you can afford it, to doing as much due diligence as you can do to verify the health of the device, using the right tools in terms of SDKs, libraries, and similar. And most important of all, trying to use factors that are non-phishable. Like I'm sure you heard of the buzz about passkeys. If your starting point is passwords, passkeys are going to be an enormous step forward. So I would advocate people playing with them as soon as they have a chance. If you're starting for platform authenticators, they might be a bit of a step down. So there is a need for a bit more care into adoption. But in general, the industry is definitely moving in a good direction in that respect.
Well, Vittorio, I really appreciate your time today and enjoyed your perspectives across so many different lenses of identity. It's one of the most interesting parts of technology to me because it touches almost everything. from the the user's fingertips or fingerprints all the way back to the the farthest back end database. I certainly would never want to stop anyone from being spending their time to be identity experts, but like in that last discussion, if you're a pharmaceutical company, I guess I, as a consumer, would really like those people to spend their 60, 70, 80 hours a week working on molecules to fight cancer and COVID and things like that. And I wouldn't stand in anyone's way to learn the ins and outs of identity protocols, but the less they're spending that time on that, the better. Really appreciate it. I hope we can talk again sometime, maybe after you've done your presentation in Seattle on security threats. That's a particular interest of mine. And grazie ragazzi for your time today, Vittorio.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been 2 decades at this point, so it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.